Hey Dimir Mages, today I'm here to talk about the undercover elephant in the room, which is why is Dimir Control so unplayable in Pioneer? Now, while this wasn't a specific question that I've been asked, I've seen it around Pioneer in general for a very long time. There was a recent thread on the Pioneer subreddit that was seeking suggestions on how people would go about building the deck, and as you might think, there were just a bunch of suggestions to drop the black entirely and just stick to a normal Azorius Control deck. And while the TLDR is if you're trying to be competitive, they're right. You shouldn't be trying to build Dimir Control. It's because Azorius is probably one of the best decks in the format right now and probably one of the strongest. I do think that there is some way that you can build Dimir if you're trying to be a little bit more casual about your play. So instead of just lamenting the fact that Dimir is weaker than its guildmate relative, I'm going to dive a little bit more into the construction of the Dimir Control archetype. This video is going to highlight some problem areas for the deck, from card type to card selection, and then give you an idea of how you can best patch the holes in your leaky ship and try to sail it to a couple of FNM victories. To begin, we need to understand what the main thing Dimir Control decks lack in comparison to other control archetypes, including the 3-color Lotus Field variants, the Azorius variants, all the different kinds of control decks out there. Now, the main philosophy behind a control deck is, as the name suggests, you want to control the board, making sure that the game is safely out of reach from your opponent before you can deploy your own game-winning threats to close out the game swiftly and securely. The pathway to those threats and the game-ending cards themselves, however, are the most glaring issues for a Dimir Control deck, which isn't a great place to start when building. Now let's begin on the lower end of the curve where everything kind of starts. Dimir's strengths are in the fact that it has powerful disruption spells and the ability to set their opponents behind for a very low mana cost. We're all familiar with what black brings to the table, so there's hand disruption like Thoughtseize, as well as cheap interaction and removal like Fatal Push, and Bitter Triumph, which is a newer spell which even targets Planeswalkers. So a lot of low mana cost, interactive, disruptive spells from the black side. The blue side brings in card selection and card advantage, as well as interaction in the form of specific counter magic spells. Now, blue has all of the same cards between Dimir, Azorius, and any of the control variants, because blue is going to be the predominant color. So instead, we're going to focus on the main things that it gives to Dimir. So not Make Disappear, not Dig Through Time, but the unique Dimir cards Drown in the Lock and Siphon Insight. Both of these Dimir options are extremely unique, but also extremely situational. Drown in the Lock has the upside of being a modal spell and is an all-star in formats like Modern. However, without the fetch lands in this format, there isn't a lot that's filling our opponent's graveyards early enough to make it reliable without crafting our deck in a specific way. Likewise, Siphon Insight, this kind of effect can steal us the most powerful card in our opponent's deck, or it could steal a land. While the flashback cost is nice, it's cheap, and you could do this effect multiple times, it's not the huge tempo swing that we're looking for every single time, and that inconsistency makes it a bit of a weaker card. Now let's compare these Dimir options to the cards that are seen in Azorius decks and their specific blue-white counterparts. Dovin's Veto, Absorb, and the soon-to-be newly released No More Lies. These early interactive cards not only disrupt their opponent's plans, but they're also great at providing extra effects or just extra things tacked onto the card that are hard to deal with. Dovin's Veto instantly wins the counter war over any of their opponent's spells, including powerful game-ending Planeswalkers, because it can't be countered. While Absorb on the other side is great against the aggro decks and things trying to deal damage through combat, because it can do almost an entire turn's worth of damage by just gaining 3 life and countering a spell. This doesn't even touch upon the tempo that No More Lies will be able to give these control decks, just being a counter spell that your opponents really can't pay for on turns 2 or even 3, and we don't even need to talk about the higher cost cards in the deck like Sphinx's Revelation that just drills home the superiority of these Azorius color cards. The other thing that Dimir is sorely lacking is a solid board wipe. Now, Azorius gets 3 of them, though. We have Supreme Verdict, Sunfall, and Farewell that are all powerful and sequential casting mana cards that just reset the board, no questions asked. When you're looking for the same types of cards in Dimir, all the board wipes have some sort of stipulation or condition to them. The best that you get as a straight board wipe is Bontu's Last Reckoning, which doesn't only make the 3 mana you're casting the spell with not untap, it makes all of our lands unable to untap the next turn, so this is even worse in the later game. There's Ritual of Soot, which only works for small things. There's Crux of Fate at 5 mana that can't even hit anything or everything if a dragon is on the battlefield, or a non-dragon and a lot of dragons, so it's modal but not the greatest. And then Extinction Event makes us choose one side of the board to exile, odd or even. You can't hit both at the same time, you need 2 spells for it. Dimir is getting a little bit of help in this category though, in the form of Deadly Cover-Up very soon, but that's just 1 card to Azorius' 3, and Deadly Cover-Up can still draw our opponent's cards sometimes, so it still has a downside. Because of this glaring weakness in card quality, Dimir decks often have to overload on single target removal and hand disruption. As a control deck, your hand disruption is going to get weaker the longer a game goes, since you're eventually going to get your opponent into top deck mode, or they're going to be drawing more cards than you can discard later on, and being able to instantly cast them with plenty of lands in play. 1-for-1 removal is going to be fine until your opponent can deploy multiple threats in a turn, or until you run out of your removal spells to cast. While it isn't the worst to have extra spells in the deck, it does mean that you have even less spots for game-ending cards because you need all these extra slots to even get to your endgame. Now, on the other hand, Dimir is no stranger when it comes to powerful threats. In fact, there have been some historically powerful finishers in Dimir colors, not forgetting the current 4-mana Phyrexian that terrorizes threats in mid-range shells all across Pioneer. However, cards like Dragonguard Silumgar, the Scarab God, and Toxrill the Corrosive all have one glaring weakness in common: the fact that they're all creatures. The truth of the matter is, having power and toughness in the control deck is detrimental to your game plan if you ever stumble. Forcing a board wipe on your own game-ending threat is never where you want to be as a control deck, and exposing your own game-ending threat as a needed recovery mechanic to something like a go-for-the-throat of all things is incredibly bad tempo swing for your deck. Even cards like a Lockmere Serpent that can get around some of this by coming into play on your opponent's turn thanks to Flash, these still suffer from the fact that they have no secure way of providing a clock or a forced choice from opponents. Lockmere Serpent gets rid of lands to become unblockable, so you're setting yourself behind to maybe get yourself in for some game-ending damage. Now, one card I want to mention on its own is Hullbreaker Horror. This card is a clear omission from Azorius list, but a main draw to the Dimir lists. The powerful Kraken Horror has a lot of upsides, like Flash, uncounterability, and the ability to turn your own cantrips into mini remands. The downside, though, is while it can return spells to hand, it cannot outright counter them. So while you can dodge a Go for the Throat with a Consider, your opponent just taps 2 more mana and repeats their spell. So you need to be massively ahead or have a handful of spells for it to really close out a game. And for all the upsides that Hullbreaker Horror brings, it's still outclassed by the finishers in Azorius. Now, if you take a look at the popular Azorius Control list, you find 4 main ways for them to win the game. 2 of these cards can be shared with the Dimir decks in the form of Shark Typhoon and Hall of Storm Giants, which helps out in longer games. And then the other 2 are what make the Azorius deck, in my opinion, the superior choice of control deck in the format. Those 2 cards are the Wandering Emperor and Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Not only are these cards game-ending threats from the deck, but they provide immediate, tangible effects on the battlefield the turn that they are played, in addition to the ability to close out games quickly. Emperor not only removes a threat and buffers life totals, but it can make a wall of blockers and is a must-answer card that stopgaps decks while the control list just sits there, draws cards, passes the turn with removal in hand, and has really no care for the world. Speaking of, the Wandering Emperor has no care for Supreme Verdict because it doesn't die to it. The Samurais do, but then the Emperor just ticks down, makes another Samurai after a board wipe, and then all of a sudden the control deck is up on board in addition to cards in hand and interaction too. So a very powerful synergy there. Teferi is another card that provides immediate advantage for the deck, drawing a card and untapping 2 lands to hold up interaction. In the Lotus Field versions, this could be up to 6 mana, which is just another threat if they need it. But most of the time, it's like a 3 mana Planeswalker instead of a 5 mana one if it's played on a relatively safe board, because then you get to hold up counter magic for the next turn. You get to hold up interaction for something to try to kill it if they're attacking into it. Teferi just stays safe all by itself. When you take a look back over at Dimir, there aren't really any cards of similar power or similar effects to rival the Wandering Emperor or Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Over the years, Dimir's colors have gotten planeswalkers that were played in controller mid-range shells such as Liliana Leveil, Ashiok Nightmare Weaver, or even Jace Architect of Thought. However, none of these sometimes game-ending threats can control the board the way that their Azorius counterparts can, let alone none of them can be played at instant speed like the Wandering Emperor. Now, because of these glaring weaknesses when building the deck, people usually forego the control aspect of Dimir entirely and build more towards a mid-range style of deck. However, I do think Dimir Control can be built, but it needs a bit of a gimmick or a combo in order to be successful. Therefore, there are 3 styles of deck I think can hang with some of the Pioneer meta decks, each with its own strengths and its own weaknesses. First up is sort of the OG Dimir Control plan for the Pioneer format, which is Narset Parter of Veils plus Days Undoing. This deck looks to lock its opponents out of the game by slamming Narset, casting Days Undoing, and then making it so their opponents never get to cast a sorcery speed spell for the remainder of the game. Gyro Reach Sanitarium helps keep them locked out by making them discard a card on their draw step, so the only chance they have to cast something is at instant speed during their draw step with their single draw for their turn. The deck supplements this combo with Shieldred the Apocalypse, and in some cases Notion's Thief, as a second playset of Narset, so to speak. Plenty of 1-for-1 removal and cheap counter magic like Swan Song or Mystical Dispute to back up a combo turn. This deck looks to punish mid-range and control decks, while it really just kind of rolls over to sort of any fast aggro or fast combo deck. The next Dimir Control variant that I suggest trying gained some popularity as a mid-range deck first about a year ago now, and revolves around the combo of Archfiend of the Dross and Metamorphic Alteration to instantly, or on the next upkeep, win the game. Step 1, make sure your opponent has a creature on the field. Step 2, cast your Archfiend of the Dross. Step 3, cast your Metamorphic Alteration on your opponent's creature, turning it into the 6/6 demon. This will cause your opponent to lose on their upkeep, as their newly created Archfiend has no oil counters on it. If they can't kill their own creature before their upkeep, it's GG. This deck features Dig Through Time and a ton of cantrip spells like Consider in order to find the combo pieces, and runs Swan Song as the main counterspell of choice to ensure that your opponent always has a creature that you can combo onto. This deck has a great matchup against any creature-based deck, but it does struggle against combo and control decks that generally don't run creatures. The final control variant that I think has some power in Dimir is a Dimir Control shell relying on Thing in the Ice as its main way of winning the game. Since Thing in the Ice is a mini Wrath itself, this shores up one of the weaknesses that normal Dimir decks have by stonewalling aggro early and then flipping on over into a win condition on an empty board in a way that is as close to a Planeswalker power as possible. These decks often have Ledger Shredder as a backup way to win, as well as a threat to help find the right pieces of interaction at the right time thanks to Connive. Tons of single target removal and low mana costing cantrips are here to flip Thing as fast as possible, with the option of adding cards at the higher end of the curve like Torrential Gearhulk or your favorite Dimir Planeswalker of choice to give it a little bit more reach. This style of deck is great against aggro lists, but it may actually struggle more against mid-range decks than some of the other control shells because they have their own spot removal to get rid of your Thing in the Ice. I believe its control matchup is alright, but not favored. However, it does make their board wipes less impactful than they usually are, and does make them struggle a little bit if they don't have early interaction. Now, if none of these decks appeal to you, I do encourage you to play around with lists of your own to find something that you enjoy. Winning isn't everything when it comes to Magic, and if you want to sling around in Garrick's Wake as a way to punish people, then more power to you. But if you're looking at Dimir and want to compete with the deck, I would suggest checking out a more tempo-style deck like Rogues, where low mana Dimir spells are more impactful when backed up by a clock of Soaring Thought Thief and Brazen Borrower. It also helps make Drown in the Loch a very powerful counter spell or removal spell exactly when you need it. That's it for this video. If I've motivated you to get out there and sling some spells, show your appreciation with a comment below and tap the subscribe button. See you later.